January 2004. The Swedish police were searching for a masked suspect who had gunned down 2 members of a Christian group at point-blank range.
We were puzzled. We had no clue to any kind of motive.
I think everyone in the church were afraid that they should be killed. It was so unbelievable what's happening.
Sweden was soon gripped by a strange tale of love triangles, religion and murder.
This was an unbelievable story.
It was the biggest crime situation in Swedish history.
As well as the police, others also chronicled the investigation on film, on paper and on tape. Through their lenses, they captured the story of terror by text. Knutby is a remote village near Sweden's east coast. With less than 600 residents, it was considered a safe and close-knit community. It was home to many members of the Philadelphia Church, a Christian group renowned for its strict interpretation of the Bible.
It's common people, people who believes in God, who wants to live their life according to the Bible.
They had about 100 members, mostly young people, lots of families living very close together, lots of meetings, very isolated.
In 2004, one local minister was 32-year-old Helga Fossmo.
A dominant person in the community. He came from Norway. He was charismatic and people liked him there and had respect for him too.
Helge was a person that always got people on his side. Somehow he attracted people, and he had this character that made people believe in what he says. We look up to him because of his knowledge.
Helga had 3 young children from an earlier marriage, which had ended when his first wife died. He had since remarried, this time to 23-year-old Alexandra.
Alexandra was a marvelous girl. She always looked up to me as a big sister. Her favorite things to do, I think, was actually to make the children happy. I can truly say she was one of the kindest person I know.
Helga and Alexandra lived on a secluded street not far from Daniel Linde, another member of the religious group.
They were all parts of the community. I think Daniel Linde thought of Helge Fossmo as one of his closest friends at that time. So they all knew each other well.
The 9th of January 2004, a cold winter's night. Helga and Alexandra headed off to bed. In the middle of the night, Helga checked on his children and ended up sleeping in their room.
Helge Fossmo was in his house in one of the children's rooms. One of the boys had been waken up earlier that night, so he was in one of the boys' beds.
Down the road, Daniel Linde was also in bed. Shortly after 4:30 a.m., he stirred.
There was someone knocking at his door. He was asleep. He woke up. He unlocked the door, and there were one masked person standing there, pointing a gun at him. His first thought was that this is a joke, and then he was shot in the chest and in the jaw.
Daniel managed to reach his mobile phone and call the local emergency services.
När Daniel ringde så tog det en tid innan
When Daniel called, it took the operator some time before they understood that something had happened. He was slurring a lot and had a hard time speaking as he'd been shot straight in the mouth.
An ambulance was soon on the scene. As he was carried off, Daniel asked someone to call Pastor Helge Fossmo. Daniel wanted Helge to accompany him to the hospital.
So Helge Fossmo was called to Daniel Linde's house by a phone call of one of the members of the congregation.
Helge woke up, put his shoes on and his jacket and ran down to Daniel's house without telling his wife.
As the ambulance rushed off, the police set up roadblocks throughout the area, hoping to catch the gunman.
Det som fanns då, det var att
What they knew then was that we were looking for a pretty big perpetrator. They were talking about a fairly large, dark-clothed man, and it was that description the officers at the roadblocks received.
At the same time, a perimeter was established around Daniel Linde's home. Local photographer Sven-Olof Ahlgren was one of the first members of the media to reach the scene.
What surprised me was that it was so many policemen. It looks to me they were very heavily armed, and it seems it was the special forces with dogs.
Moments later, friends walked over to Helge Fossmo's house to let Alexandra know that Helge had gone with Daniel to the hospital. Inside, they found the children still asleep. But Alexandra Fossmo was lying dead in her upstairs bed.
And in that point, there was a woman coming out from Fossmo's house and screaming, "Please help me, please help me. I can't wake Alexandra up, and there's blood everywhere." It was kind of a shock. I didn't know what was going on, just what's happening here? Too much happening too close to my own home.
Direkt när de kom ut från huset och meddelade att hon låg skjuten uppe.
Right away, when they came out from the house and announced that she was shot upstairs, our tactical squad came into the house and searched it and found the Fossmo family's children in a bedroom. They then took them, carried them out, and brought them to another house in the area.
It appeared that the masked gunman had struck at least twice in the same street.
Då började jag fundera över.
That's when I started wondering, are there any other victims?
Across town, Pastor Helge Fossmo was talking to detectives about the attack on his neighbor when he was informed of the grim discovery in his own home.
Och han bröt då ihop.
Then he broke down, cried, and showed a lot of emotions for a couple of minutes.
I ett par minuter.
I think everyone was in shock in Knutby.
Alexandra's sister, Pastor Asa Waldau, was out of the country when the shootings took place.
I got the message that first of all, Daniel was shot by someone who broke into his home. Second, but worst, they found Sanna killed in her bed, and it's probably the same murderer.
Their families and friends were in shock. Meanwhile, the police continued to search the crime scene for clues.
Police found out that the person who had been shooting in Alexandra Fossmo's house must have had a key, or maybe the door was unlocked, because there was no violent break into the house and no signs of violence at all.
Forensic expert Staffan Källström was part of the team examining the Fossmo home.
I photographed the room from different angles. Someone went there and killed the victim when she was asleep. She didn't wake up by the shooting. We saw a hole in the pillow, and inside the pillow we found a bullet from a .38 caliber gun.
Perhaps most intriguing was the evidence found in the snow surrounding the two homes.
Outside Daniel Linde's house, police found footprints from one person. The police followed the footprints and they took help from dogs, the footprints coming from a place in the woods. Well, they followed the footprints backwards, and they came to a place where they could see marks on the ground from a car. So they assumed the shooter had gone away by car.
Vi kunde också då, när vi gjorde det, se spåren som ledde från bilen.
We could see the tracks going from the car to the crime scene, and then we could see in what order the perpetrator had walked. At first they had gone to Helga Fossimo's house, where they had shot Alexandra. Then the perpetrator had gone outside, and from there walked around Danielle Linda's house, and walked around the whole house, and walked in through the front of the house.
The police made casts of the tire treads and footprints, but the size of the footprints seemed to contradict the original description of the shooter.
The information given from Daniel Linda was that it was a masked man, so that was the police theory from the beginning.
The footprints that they had found in the snow was pretty small, about size 6. So that would show that they were looking not for a man, but probably for a woman.
While the police continued to investigate, news of a murder in the close-knit religious community spread quickly.
I think the public was interested in this case because it was so unusual. There was this small village, there was a religious movement, a religious congregation. I think basically that was the reason why people were so interested in the beginning. Everyone realized from the beginning that this was something very special. This was a very special case.
At first, the police had few leads as to the shooter's identity. Surviving victim Daniel Linda seemed to have no known enemies.
Daniel Linda couldn't talk at all when he came to the hospital, and he had to write his answers on a paper, or he could just nod his head.
After interviewing Daniel Linda, the police had no clue, actually. He couldn't give any explanation at all to this shooting, and there didn't seem to be any hostile relations in this community, and we were puzzled. I think we thought from the beginning that it was strange that there was one single shooter and maybe a woman, and we tried to figure out some reason for a person to go in and shoot these two persons. There was no signs of a motive at all. We didn't know.
One of the theories was that this had to do with jealousy inside the congregation between members. Another theory was that this was some sort of a revenge, maybe from people outside the congregation.
The police now knew that the killer had gone to Helga's house first, then to Daniel Linda's. Helga had been in the children's room, but the police found it odd that he hadn't heard his wife being shot, particularly when he had been woken by a phone call minutes later.
Helga had claimed that he was asleep during the shooting. He hadn't heard any shot. He is very used to be alarmed by the cell phone when there are members of the congregation needs help or need him to talk to. So that was his explanation why he woke up by the cell phone and didn't wake up at the shots.
The police would soon get their first strong lead in the case and discover that religious belief might have been a key motive for the attack. January 2004. Police in the Swedish village of Knutby were investigating a shocking crime. A masked suspect had murdered Alexandra Fossmo, the wife of a prominent minister. Moments later, the attacker had attempted to kill her neighbor, Daniel Linda. The crime had shaken the quiet religious community.
People in the congregation was shocked, of course. People were puzzled. People were very confused about what was happening.
Many feared the congregation itself was under attack.
Some of us were staying very close. In the first moment, we slept together in big rooms, like 20 persons, 10, 15, 20 persons, because everyone was afraid.
Key to the investigation was Pastor Helga Fossmo, who was in the house when his wife was shot. He told the police that he knew someone who might have been capable of killing his wife. That someone was a young religious woman named Sarah Svensson, a former nanny in his home. According to Helga, Sarah Svensson had become infatuated with him and had attacked his wife on one occasion.
Sarah came and hit her with a hammer. Sanna came into my house. I felt her wounds and I took some ice and I said, we have to call the police. And she said, no. Look, I'm alive. I feel good. She's not dangerous. I don't know what went into her. She somehow protected her. I think she thought that Sarah didn't mean so much harm.
Sarah Svensson was sent home, sent away from the community. They did not inform the police, so police didn't know about that accident.
Given this previous attack, Sarah Svensson stood out as a definite person of interest.
After interviewing Helge and he mentioned Sarah Svensson, we thought it might be some jealousy or something between Sarah Svensson and Alexandra. Still, we didn't know why Daniel Linde had been shot.
Taking a closer look, the police discovered that the former nanny was now living with her father in another Swedish town.
We started checking our records, discovered that she didn't own a car, but her dad, on the other hand, had two cars, one Saab and one Volvo. We sent technicians out to look for similar cars and to measure the tread size of the wheels. We found that Sarah's dad's Volvo matched the tread size that we secured at the crime scene.
Adding to their suspicions, police records showed that Sarah Svensson had passed through one of their roadblocks shortly after the attack. At the time, the mass shooter was still believed to be a man.
Den första bil som stannade på platsen.
The first car that stopped, they approached and it was a Volvo, and it had a female driver. They introduced themselves as police officers and asked to see a driver's license. The officers saw her as a pretty young girl who was on her way home to her dad. They wished her a safe journey and asked her to drive carefully, and they let her pass through.
Lycklig resa och bad henne köra försiktigt och så släppte de iväg henne.
On the 11th of January, one day after the shootings, Sarah Svensson was brought in for questioning on suspicion of murder and attempted murder.
Sarah Svensson was definitely a very odd suspect. She was a pretty well educated young woman. This type of crime where you have a gunfighter, pretty cold-blooded murder, is very rarely made by women.
Although an unlikely killer, Sarah seemed to bring the mystery to a sudden end when she promptly confessed to the crime. She claimed she'd bought a gun and homemade silencer from an underworld connection in Stockholm. On the morning of the crime, she'd parked near the forest, pulled a black stocking over her head, and visited the Fosmo home first, shooting Alexandra in her bed. The homemade silencer was ineffective, so she used a pillow to cover the gun when she shot Daniel Linde.
She told police that she had done this, and she described how she had done it, and her story seemed to be correct from what the police had found out.
Sarah Svensson drew a detailed map showing where she'd disposed of key evidence.
She tried to get rid of the clothing while she was escaping, so she threw it in garbage cans at different places when she was driving from Knutby. Sarah Svensson threw the gun from the Öland Bridge into the water.
Divers were brought in to search for the gun. The police easily recovered other discarded items along her route, including the homemade silencer and footwear that linked her to the crime scene.
After a while we got her shoes from one place, and we could compare them with the tracks that we had, and we could match the size and the pattern on them.
But despite her confession, Sarah said little about why she'd attacked the two victims. The police suspected jealousy in the murder of Alexandra Fosmo, but knew of no reason why Sarah would have wanted to shoot Daniel Linder.
But she didn't reveal any more about the motives.
They also found it strange that she repeatedly went out of her way to insist that she'd acted alone.
Sarah Svensson was from the beginning very keen on pointing out that she was the only person who was involved in the shooting. What she told the police was that I've done it myself, there is no one more playing a role in this, which of course made the police suspicious.
Learning of her arrest, local church members also suspected Sarah Svensson might have had help with the crime.
At that moment, we were totally shocked, but also we felt that it could not be possible that she can be alone in this. So we were afraid that it could be some stranger lying around the bushes waiting to kill more of us. I think everyone in the church were afraid that they should be killed. It could be possible that it was an attack to our church or anything. We had these crazy thoughts. It was so unbelievable what's happening.
Daniel Linder was recovering in hospital. After providing a key tip to the police, Pastor Helge Fosmo was mourning the loss of his wife with the help of the congregation.
He was crying, and we were, as a family, gathered in grief.
The investigation, however, soon took a bizarre twist. In subsequent interviews, Sarah Svensson began to reveal more about her motives. She explained that in shooting the two victims, she was following orders from God.
She told the police that she had been hearing a voice of God telling her to do these things.
She also claimed that the orders came in the form of text messages.
Sarah Svensson told the police that she got information from God on her cell phone to kill Alexandra and to kill Daniel.
The mysterious messages became a key focus of the investigation, as did Pastor Helge Fosmo. A secret from his past might soon shed fresh light on the present. January 2004. In Knutby, Sweden, the police were investigating the murder of Alexandra Fosmo and the attempted murder of Daniel Linder, both members of a strict Pentecostal community. News that Sarah Svensson, a mild-mannered nanny, had confessed to the crimes sparked a media frenzy. The reclusive religious community was now in the national spotlight.
The village got invaded by journalists, photographers, cameramen. This village became the most famous village in Sweden.
After Sarah Svensson was arrested, of course we tried to get as much information about her as we could, which wasn't very easy at that point because members of the congregation were definitely not willing to speak about this. They didn't want to speak about it at all.
Adding to the climate of mistrust, some reports labeled the congregation a cult.
We have people around our house every day. Helicopters, cameras, papers, because it became so big. They published things about us, our family, our church, which were not true at all. Because the situation was not just for our congregation, it was for the whole village. It's a small village, it's not big. Everyone in this village, it affects everyone.
Meanwhile, the police continued to investigate the crime. Sarah Svensson had confessed, but she'd also made the bizarre claim that God had instructed her to do the shootings, communicating with her by mobile phone.
She was receiving text messages on her cell phone with instructions what to do. Instructions to go to Stockholm and try to buy a gun, a legal gun of course. instructions to the day, or what time, which houses she was going to do the shooting.
According to Sarah, the messages had also contained quotes from the Bible to give her courage to commit the crimes. Any relevant text messages had been deleted, but in the past few months, Sarah had received 400 text messages from an unregistered prepaid mobile phone ending with the numbers 1293. The police noticed that there were 18 messages from the mystery phone on the morning of the double shooting. While the police tried to learn more about the phone, they also took a closer look at Pastor Helge Fossmo. They had difficulty believing that he'd slept through the murder of his wife.
I think the police was thinking maybe he was lying about that, or that he wasn't in the house at all. I don't know. We couldn't believe that he was in the next room and couldn't have heard anything.
Adding to their suspicions was an incident in Helge Fossmo's past. It seemed that Alexandra was not the only wife Fossmo had lost to tragedy. His first wife, Helene, had also died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. 5 years earlier, Helge had been living with Helene in the same house in Knutby. A neighbor dropped by early one morning on a planned visit. When nobody answered the door, the neighbor went in and found Helge still asleep in bed. As the two men spoke, they heard water running in the bathroom. When calls to Helene went unanswered, they forced the door open. Helene was lying dead in the bath, submerged in the water.
The story was that she had a shower and fell in the bathtub and hit her head on the faucet, and the faucet was also matching in the wound in her head.
At the time, the police ruled the death accidental.
We thought it would be good to reopen that case and look into it once more.
They found there were odd discrepancies in the archived file. An autopsy carried out at the time had revealed that Helene had a toxic amount of medicine in her blood, an important fact that didn't appear in the final police report.
She was full of sleeping pills. Everything looks a little bit strange.
I think there were some difficulties in the communication between the doctors, the forensic medicine doctors, and the police. So that information didn't really came to the police knowledge.
In light of the two deaths, Helge Fossmo was becoming a suspect in the murder of both his wives. A key breakthrough regarding the mystery text messages would soon advance the investigation. January 2004. In Knutby, Sweden, a nanny called Sarah Svensson had confessed to the attempted murder of Daniel Linde and the murder of Alexandra Fossmo. But the police now believed that she hadn't acted alone. Key to the investigation was Sarah's bizarre claim that she'd received messages from God urging her to carry out the crimes.
It was very hard for the interviews to convince Sarah Svensson that the messages was not from God. It must be from some person.
In mid-January, there were some key breakthroughs. Although Sarah had erased the relevant text messages, the police had identified the number of the prepaid phone that had probably sent them, referring to it as the S phone. Since mobile phones communicate by sending signals to nearby cell towers, it was possible to identify the general location of the phone at any given time. While the mystery S phones seemed to have resided mainly in Knutby, on a few occasions, its signals suggested road trips to other parts of Sweden. On more than one occasion, the S-phone followed the exact travel itinerary of Pastor Helge Fossmo, already suspected as a potential accomplice in the murder of his wife. The S-phone also seemed to track the activity of Helge's known registered phone.
We saw on the telephone list that this special telephone, this prepaid telephone, was together with Helge's telephone, very pretty close to each other, Helge's telephone, normal telephone, and this S telephone. So he must know the telephone.
When shown the growing evidence that Helga was behind the messages, Sarah seemed genuinely shocked.
She found it hard to believe that he was involved, that he was the one sending the messages. She had hard to accept that from the beginning. She actually believed that she got messages from God.
Feeling betrayed, Sarah began to reveal more information about her relationship with the minister. She admitted that she'd had an extended affair with Helge Fossmo while living in his house as the family nanny. He'd spoken at times about how God might decide one day that it was time for his wife Alexandra to die. He'd even suggested that Sarah might be called to act as God's instrument.
Helge hade tillfrågat henne 1 år tidigare om hon kunde döda henne.
Helga had asked her 1 year earlier if she could kill a human being, and she said no. That was in the summer.
Då frågade Helge henne igen.
In the autumn of 2003, he asked again if she could kill someone, but she said no. But he asked if it's God's will, would you do it then? And she said, yeah, maybe.
Although the police still lacked hard evidence about the content of the text messages, they now believed that Helga had posed as God, instructing Sarah Svensson to kill Alexandra. But why had he then sent Sarah to kill his neighbor, Daniel Linder? On the 21st of January, still fearing a wider conspiracy, the police set up wiretaps on a number of congregation phones. Through the phone taps, the police made a startling discovery. Pastor Helge Fossmo also appeared to be romantically involved with a woman called Annette Linder, and Annette was the estranged wife of his neighbor Daniel Linder, the other victim in the double shooting. The police called both Helga and Annette in for questioning, hoping to spur revealing phone conversations between the two afterwards.
Almost immediately after they have been questioned, they took out their cell phones and called each other. And the police, of course, was tapping these phone calls, so they could just go into the listening room after the interrogation, listening to the calls. The conversations was about the last interrogation, if the questions have been difficult to answer, if the police have been hard, and they declared that they would support each other and that they loved each other. So these phone calls served the police with the motives.
It now seemed clear that as well as having an affair with his nanny Sarah, Pastor Helge Fossmo was involved with his neighbor's wife, Annette. By persuading Sarah to kill both his wife and Annette's husband, Helge could clear the obstacles to he and Annette being together without having to carry out the crime himself. On the 28th of January 2004, the police conducted a widespread raid in Knutby, searching homes and vehicles, seizing computers and telephones. Pastor Helge Fossmo and Annette Linder were taken into custody.
We thought she might have had information about this shooting and maybe taken part in the planning of it as well. I started the press conference with making an announcement that these two people were brought in for questioning, that they were suspects, that we had found out that they had a relationship and that the police could see a motive to the shooting.
What had at first seemed like a crazed act of a jealous woman now appeared to be a wider conspiracy involving two love triangles.
There was really silent in the room. I think this was a surprise for almost everybody there.
Many in the congregation found it impossible to believe that Pastor Helge Fossmo had been involved in an affair, much less murder.
First of all, we thought this is wrong. All of us protected him at first. No, it's not possible, he cannot do this.
At the time, the police still lacked hard physical evidence tying Helge Fossmo or Annette Linder to the shootings carried out by Sarah Svensson. But a forensic breakthrough involving Sarah's mobile phone might soon provide the link they needed. The 28th of January 2004, Pastor Helge Fossmo and his lover Annette Linder had been arrested for the murder and attempted murder of their 2 spouses. Although neither of them had pulled the trigger, the police believed Fosmo had posed as God in text messages to convince a young religious woman, Sarah Svensson, to carry out the crimes. Investigator Leif Spanbo was in charge of interviewing Fosmo after his arrest.
I went to him when he was sitting in the cell and took him to the interrogation room, and also his lawyer was there. So we just sat there in the room, and my first impression was that he was a priest, and he was straight in his back, and he was sort of giving me the impression of, I am a priest and I am not commit this crime.
While Fosmo denied any part in the murder of his wife, he did admit to having affairs with both Sarah Svensson and Annette Linde. At times, he was even seeing both women while under the same roof as his wife.
When Alexandra was sleeping, Annette was coming to his place, and then they were having an affair. But also Sarah was sleeping there. When Annette went home, Helge was going downstairs and calling Sarah, Sarah, you can come up now.
Faced with the evidence, Fosmo was also forced to admit he was the owner of Mystery Mobile Phone S, the phone in constant contact with shooter Sarah Svensson. But he denied sending his former nanny religious text messages urging her to commit the crimes. Hoping to prove him wrong, the police submitted Sarah's phone to data recovery experts at a private firm in Uppsala.
When you delete anything from your cell phone, it is not readable for you, but it's possible to recover the information, because if it's not overwritten, it's possible to recover it.
The phone had no messages stored in its internal memory, but room for up to 20 messages on its SIM card.
The SIM card had 20 positions for text messages, and we saw that 7 of those 20 positions was activated and fully readable text messages.
The readable messages were unrelated to the investigation, but special forensic software helped probe the remainder of the card.
We also looked at the 13 empty positions, and we saw that, well, here we have some information. Let's convert it. And we converted the information from the 13 positions to readable messages, and there it was. Amazing text messages with very interesting information.
So one of the text messages, for example, said that there is a time for killing and there is a time for healing.
There was one message saying that the first thing you must do because you have to, and the other thing you must do because of love of him. The real explanation was really that the first thing was killing Alexandra, the second was to killing Daniel.
For the police, the text messages confirmed Sarah Svensson's story, adding crucial evidence that Helge Fosmo was an accomplice in the crimes.
So the phone text messages could be seen as encouraging her to do the shooting.
Annette Linde was released from custody in early February after the police determined she had been unaware of the murder plot. Pastor Helge Fosmo and nanny Sarah Svensson went to trial in May 2004.
Sarah Svensson was charged with murder and attempt to murder, and Helge Fosmo was charged with incitement of murder and attempt to murder.
Fosmo was also charged with the murder of his first wife Helene, whose death the police now believed was not accidental.
The media coverage of the trial was huge. The top headline every day during the trial. This was so unbelievable, this case. If anyone would have written this as a book or as a manuscript for a film, it would never have been published. It would have been seen too unrealistic and too weird and, too out of the blue. But this was actually was happened.
The most important thing was Sarah Svensson's story, which seemed to be correct in every detail, and these text messages that came from his cell phone to her that couldn't mean anything but encouraging her to do this, to shoot these people.
One very central movement in the trial was when Sarah Svensson was telling her story. That was a very touching moment. She was under very hard pressure, you could say. She had difficulties in telling it. She was interrogated for, I think, about 7 hours that day in the court. And she was more or less telling the story from the first day she came to Knutby until the shooting in January. I remember when she was telling about how she had parked the car and was walking towards the houses. At one point she stopped on the field and she took up her cell phone to look if there had come any new messages. She hoped that those messages would tell her to stop. And at that point I think it struck me that how absurd this story was. This was a 26-year-old woman looking at her cell phone for a message to stop killing.
Although Helge protested his innocence, the prosecution painted a vivid picture of a man who'd used his religious authority to seduce and brainwash a young woman, eventually convincing her to commit the ultimate crime.
I think that Helge controlled Sarah by saying this is God's will. And since she trusted Helge as a man from God, she put her belief in his word more than trusting what she knew what was right. He made her believe that it was God's will that she should shoot Alexandra. For me, as a believer, it's the worst thing you can do, to use God's name in your own wishes in that horrible way.
To further undermine Fossmo's plea of innocence, members of the court were taken to his house for a recreation of the morning of the crimes.
The court was taken to the Fossmo house and up to the children's room where Helge Fossmo said he was sleeping during the shooting. There were a police officer standing in the bedroom where Alexandra was shot. He was holding the same type of gun that Sarah Svensson has used. He was shooting into a bucket of sand and thick paper. When we heard the shot, you could definitely say they were spread in all of the house. I would definitely have been awakened if someone else had shot.
Helge Fossmo was found guilty of incitement in the murder and attempted murder of his wife Alexandra and his neighbor Daniel Linder. But due to insufficient evidence, he was found not guilty of murdering his first wife Helene. He was sentenced to life in prison.
I think Helge's personality is he needs to be in control. And I think it's like some kind of a main road here. Sex, power over women, it makes you feel as a man. So maybe there are no more reasons than just he is in that need to conquer women. Maybe that's all. I feel stupid, I feel fooled for the rest of my life. Because I've looked into his eyes and honestly believed him, every word. I trusted him being a man from God. This is a nightmare for the rest of my life, to remember that you were so close to a person and never discovered anything that evil. He was planning all the time how to kill my sister.
Sarah Svensson was convicted of murder and attempted murder. She was deemed by the court to be mentally ill and sentenced to psychiatric care.
And she had psychiatric care controlled by a judge, actually, so she's not supposed to be released from hospital until a judge says she can be.
I think she was a broken woman. She actually thought that she did the will of God. Strange enough, but I think she thought so.
Helge Fossmo remains behind bars, but his crimes left their mark on the Pentecostal congregation in the small village of Knutby. Along with a loss of life came a loss of trust.
This was a very, very sad thing that's happened. to the community and to Alexandra's and Daniel's families.
A murderer kills so much more than just the person he hurts by taking the life. Kills so many more situations. How can my children, how can they ever trust anyone again? Their own uncle killed their aunt. The sad thing for everyone that loses someone is that the person you remember is the killer. But the person who really lost their life, who was lost, is forgotten. Those who should be forgotten is the killers, because they are not worthy to be remembered.